let's understand this book a little bit. I'm going to give you just a brief introduction to this. Some of you, this may be very repetitive, but I want us to all get on the same page. I want you to hold the Bible on your lap just like this. So we're going to kind of go through this carefully. Let's ask a couple questions. The Bible, the title Bible means a collection of sacred books. How many books are there in the Bible? There's an Old Testament written before Jesus, a New Testament written after Jesus. How many books are there? There's an easy way to remember this. How many letters in the word old? How many letters in the word testament? 9. How many books in the Old Testament? 39. How many letters in the word new? 3. How many letters in the word testament? 9. But in the New Testament, it is the multiplication of God's word out into the world. So when you multiply 3 and 9, you get the number of books in the New Testament. You add that together, you get 66 books in the Bible. That's how you can remember that. So let's open up the Bible to Genesis, the first book, Genesis chapter 1. You'll notice that the Bible is divided, the books of the Bible, the 66 books of the Bible are divided into chapters and verses. Those were not originally part of the Bible, they were added later. It begins with a chapter 1, and then the little letters in the chapters are the verse numbers. So if you're looking up a verse, you look up the book, and then the chapter, and then the verse. I'm going to give you a brief overview of the Bible. And right now, if you're taking notes, I want you to stop taking notes. You can look back later online if you want to do this. I want this to be a little more intuitive. I want you to have the Bible in front of you, and we're going to page through it. I'm going to give you 5 sections of the Old Testament and 5 sections of the New Testament that are pretty easy to remember and that you can also teach others with it. So, start with Genesis. You got your hand here. You just start paging through Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. The first 5 books. These are the original. This is the original Bible. Just hold it in your hands like that. This is called the Torah or the law, or sometimes just called the books of Moses. This was the original Bible for the Hebrew people and for us as well. That's the first section of the Old Testament. Gives teaching about the beginning and also all the way through God's people into the promised land. Then the next section starts with Joshua. Start with Joshua as they went into the promised land. Judges, people that ruled Israel. Then we got a little book called Ruth, which is really a tender book to read. Then you get into a bunch of history books, 1st and 2nd Samuel. Keep paging. You're going to touch every book of the Bible today. 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. Keep going. 1st and 2nd Chronicles. A lot of those books repeat a lot of the historical accounts. Just like the Gospels do with Jesus, they repeat the accounts of God's people, the Hebrews. Then you get to, what's next? Ezra. And then Nehemiah, more history books. And finally, the story of Queen Esther, very brave woman. Hold those together from Joshua to Esther like this. Those are history books. So that's the second section. You got the Torah, the first 5 books, then the history books, and then you start with Job. What do you notice right away? It's kind of written in poetry form. Most of these next books are written in poetry form. They're writings. You have Job, then you have the songbook of ancient Israel, what's called the Psalms, that was the hymn book. Then you get to some wisdom books, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and then the Song of Songs, which you'd love me to preach about, I'm sure. It's a big love song. That's called the writings. That's the third section. It's right in the middle of the Bible, by the way. That's the third section of the Old Testament. So we have the first 5 books, the history books, then the writings. Then we have the major prophets. They're major because they were major, and they wrote a lot. So you got Isaiah, you got Jeremiah, another major prophet. Jeremiah wrote the book of Lamentations, so that's why it appears there. And then you got Ezekiel, a very wild book. And then Daniel, also a very wild book. Those are the major prophets. So that's the third section, major prophet. You have the first 5 books, you have the history, you have the writings, then you got the major prophets. Then starting with Hosea, you have the minor prophets. Hosea, Joel, Amos, Micah, Jonah. Did I get Jonah in there? Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai. I'm skipping some. I can see they're so small. Zechariah and Malachi. Those are the minor prophets. That's the 5th section. 5 sections of the Old Testament. The first 5 books, the history books, the writings, the major prophets, then the minor prophets. Then you move to the New Testament, written after Jesus. The Old Testament written before Jesus. The New Testament after Jesus. You have the first 4 books, which are called the Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They contain the story of Jesus. In the traditional worship, whenever we read the Gospel, we stand up because it teaches us about Jesus, the center of the Bible. That's the first section of the New Testament, the Gospels. The second section is just one book, Acts. It's the Acts of the Apostles. It's what happened to the apostles after Jesus rose and ascended to heaven. The main characters there are Peter and Paul. That's the second section. So you got the Gospels, you got the Acts of the Apostles. Then you have Paul's letters. They start with the longest of them, Romans. These are letters that Paul wrote to the people in Rome. Secondly, the people in Corinth. You got 1st and 2nd Corinthians. Then the people in Galatia, Galatians, then Ephesians, then Philippians, Colossians. These are letters he wrote to those people. Now, it's helpful sometimes to have a way of remembering books. This is how I remember those books. Real Christians eat pie constantly. Real Romans, Christians, Corinthians, who are good. Real Christians who are good. Galatians, eat. Ephesians, pie. Philippians, constantly. Colossians. That's how I remember that. So that's one way to remember. You can develop your own. And then all of Paul's letters that start with a T are together there. 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, and then the last of Paul's letters, Philemon. So that's the next section. Get that in your hands like that. That's Paul's letters. And then following Paul's letters are what are called the general letters written by others. Hebrews, we don't know who wrote Hebrews. James, that was the brother of Jesus, wrote that. 1st and 2nd Peter, that's the Apostle Peter. Then 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, that's the Apostle John wrote. And then Jude, who was another brother of Jesus. That's the 4th section, the general letters. And then the last is the book of Revelation, written by the Apostle John by a vision. So there you have the 5 sections of the New Testament. The Gospels, the letters, the Acts of the Apostles, the letters of Paul, the general letters, and Revelation. That way you can kind of put that all together and begin to know where to look for the books when you look them up.